we are incredibly fortunate to have the acclaimed actress Miriam Margolyes reading Fanya from Journey Through a Small Planet.
Hello, Emanuel. Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. How lovely to be here and to be able to celebrate this fine writer in the East End, this rapidly disappearing East End. And I feel very honoured to be here with you. Can you hear me? This is the important thing. Good. Well, I have the honour to be reading a chapter from Emanuel's book. It's quite a racy chapter, so if you find sex worrying, you better leave now. But it's a wonderful evocation of a world that is gone. The chapter is called Fanya. When I was growing up, you could spend 3 hours in the gallery of a picture palace for 4p and see 2 terrific all-star features. The Living Theatre couldn't compete. No wonder everyone said it was dying. Then Herschel Rosenheim broke Fanya Ziegelbaum's heart when the New York Yiddish troupe played a season at the Whitechapel Pavilion. And because I tasted a drop of that bitterness, Rosenheim's Hamlet remained with me long after I'd forgotten the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or who played Al Jolson's Sonny Boy in The Jazz Singer. Fanya first came to work for us when she was 14, a scraggy, brown-faced orphan whose stockings wrinkled on her matchstick legs. She smelled of dirty knickers and aroused all my 9-year-old mistrust of girls. My mother took her in as an apprentice because it was a mitzvah. She lived with a stingy aunt in a tall, barrack-like building in one of the worst streets off Commercial Road. The aunt economized on Fanya's food to stuff the mouths of her own 4 fat children. She and her husband made a living out of watching corpses, a ritual requirement, augmenting their income by selling the deceased clothes to a second-hand dealer with whom they had an arrangement. Such an environment could have a dreadful effect on a young girl, but Fanya had the remedy in her own hands. Quick to pick up the essentials of dressmaking, after a year or so she went up west with my mother's blessing to earn good money in the high-class trade. Still, she was always ready to help out with a big wedding order or some other emergencies, and so never became a stranger. Every time she returned, skinny Fanya seemed to grow plumper, particularly in the tender region of the chest and behind, where the flesh curved like 2 twin moons. She'd left her aunt to lodge with a young widow, a saleslady in the cosmetics trade, who knew a lot about being smart. As a result, the change in Fanya became startling. She walked around in West End dresses copied from ladies' magazines and stitched by her own hand. Her mouth pouted kiss-proof lipstick, the colour of raspberry jam. She scented her breath with cashews and did something to her eyes to make them large and brilliant. In short, she'd suddenly turned into a beauty. And although not everybody approved, some of the women said she'd made herself look common, most people agreed that such a picture as Fanya was sure to find a marvellous boy, maybe even with his own business. I hoped so too, because she was one of the first girls I really loved. Late one night, about 11 o'clock, I was detailed to walk Fanya home. Her route led under the railway arch, where Goyim were supposed to lurk, maddened with drink and lust. My mother wouldn't let her go alone, nor with my stepfather, nor with Abie for that matter. Not that she didn't trust them exactly, but she was inclined to believe that the Dybbuk of temptation haunted certain dark and evil places. And I suppose it seemed less likely that the fiend would seize a sexually unready boy of 13. For my part, I was flattered to play the protector of so lovely a girl. and felt every older every minute as we walked side by side. "We're walking past the scene of Jack the Ripper's most famous murder," I announced. "It was a foggy night. The woman came out of a pub when she saw this figure in a black coat. He dragged her under the railway arch and slashed her so much the blood ran down the gutter." "You're trying to frighten me?" Her eyes were black and enormous. "I'll tell your mum." I hadn't realised that scaring girls was so thrilling. "And on God's honour, Fanya, he was a famous doctor who got a disease and became a sex maniac. That's why he cut up women. You can read all about it in the library." "They haven't got things like that in the library," Fanya said, beginning to go faster. "It wouldn't be allowed." "But, Fanya, I don't want to hear any more." She spoke in a severe, grown-up voice, so I shrugged and let her walk on alone. She'd only gone a few yards, glancing back at me nervously, when two men lurched round the corner, roaring drunk. They staggered along the narrow pavement towards us, singing a dirty song. We clung together for mutual protection, pressing close to the wall. The softness of her was a shock of illicit delight. My pressure became urgent. As our bellies touched, my boy's cock strained towards a premature maturity, and even when the men had gone, we did not immediately separate. We were about the same height. She had a rich, dark smell, like a pungent animal. Our mouths came together clumsily, and I tasted the sophistication of cashews on her breath, a sinful, corrupt, oriental flavour. She wrenched herself away. The night throbbed with darkness and shame. We walked along in silence interminably. At last we reached the lights of Whitechapel and exchanged a sideways glance. Electric music came out of pin-table saloons. Young men with heavily padded shoulders swaggered by, whistling aimlessly. Fanya was obviously anxious to get rid of me as quickly as possible. I understood her embarrassment. She didn't want to be seen promenading with a boy in short trousers, especially after what had happened. As she hurried away, a youth with brilliantined hair called out in an American drawl, "Hey, sugar, what's your hurry?" I went home very slowly, remembering the shape of that softness, and confused by it. Undressing for bed, I looked at the hair that had started to grow below my thin belly. It reminded me that I must inevitably inherit the hairiness of men, their grotesque, depressing lusts, and all night long I burned with a shameful fever. The New York Yiddish Theatre opened its London season that autumn with what the drama critic of our building, a watchmaker called Shmulik, described as a daring translation of Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's Nathan the Wise. I heard him discussing it with old Mrs. Rosen, the grocer, while she was at her daily task of weighing sugar into blue paper bags. Lessing was an assimilationist of the worst kind, according to Shmulik, and consequently he made his heroine, Recha, fall in love with a goy of exceptional vulgarity, a Shagans. Mrs. Rosen shook her head with disapproving vigour, her ritual wig almost slipping into the sugar. Even at the best of times, Nathan the Wise wasn't Shmulik's favourite play, but on top of everything, he had the bad luck to sit next to a woman who didn't stop eating fried fish the whole performance. "She must also have been a critic," he remarked sourly. The failure of Nathan the Wise was redressed by the next production, a Goldfaden comedy, the title of which I've forgotten. It succeeded because it made people laugh and cry and remember the past, all at the same time. After the triumphant first night, there was a stampede for the box office by every class of Jew, from master tailor to underpresser. The money rolled up in taxis all the way from Park Lane and Stamford Hill. but mixed on equal terms with class-conscious proletarians, toothless crones who could barely hobble to the marketplace, raced along Whitechapel as if rejuvenated and used their stick-like elbows to reach the front of the uproarious queue. Trampled peanut shells and discarded sweet papers made the pavement look like Victoria Park on a bank holiday. There were vendors selling hot bagels, baked potatoes, fruit, chestnuts, fizzy drinks. Down-at-heel rabbinical types with matted beards solicited alms for yeshivot in Vilna or Jerusalem. Street musicians, who hadn't played the fiddle for years, scratched out their rusty tunes. Everybody said it was like the old days at the Pavilion, and elderly intellectuals in Goida's restaurant, squeezing the last drop of lemon juice into their tea, predicted a miraculous revival of Yiddish culture. All this, of course, hardly affected the younger generation, and Fanya Zeigelbaum might never even have met Rosenheim if the American troops' costumes had not needed constant running repairs. She was introduced to the wardrobe mistress by a mutual friend. On her very first evening, Rosenheim strode off stage wearing buckskin breeches and cavalry boots. He was full of fire and tenderness, still under the influence of his romantic role. Fanya went down on her knees to stitch up the split seam, and as she did so, she was later to tell my mother, the actor put out his hand to stroke the back of her neck. He must have been pleasantly surprised by her youth and freshness, for even ingenues in the Yiddish theatre were performed by actresses who'd already married off their own daughters. As for Fanya, from then on, there was nothing in life she wanted more than to stand under the chuppah and become Mrs. Rosenheim. The second Mrs. Rosenheim, in fact. The actor soon confessed, but certainly he promised the last. When the season in London was over, he'd take her back to America and there make her his own little angel bride. Fanya was excited and talkative. Such a cold audience last night, she would say. You wouldn't believe. Or, with evident satisfaction, 6 curtain calls yesterday. All of a sudden, she was an expert. The future of the Yiddish theatre worried her. People would rather go and see any rubbish at the movies nowadays. And where were the playwrights, the new Sholem Aleichems? The public no longer had any respect for a Jewish actor. They spat in his face. Harry, that was what she called Herschel Rosenheim, had turned down offers to play the biggest roles on Broadway. But how long could he go on making such sacrifices? The women would surely have preferred to hear less of Rosenheim the actor and more of Rosenheim the lover. It was hard for us to believe that actors were real people. Did they bleed real blood, experience real suffering, go to the lavatory? Musicians, yes. Prize fighters also, but actors? Fanya was young, foolish. She had romantic notions. Maybe it wasn't even true about Rosenheim. Maybe it could be an exaggeration. And even if it was an ordinary working girl, what did she want with an actor? About such people, one thing was sure, morals they didn't have. My mother said, an orphan like you without even a mother or a father, you have to be careful somebody doesn't take an advantage. Everybody knew what that meant. 2 minutes pleasure, 9 months pain, and unspeakable ruin. After all, how long do you know him? Practically from yesterday. Sometimes a man pays a compliment, he makes a flirtation. Marriage, my mother said heavily, is for a whole lifetime. Fanya was a serious girl. She thought for a while before replying, then looked into my mother's face with the solemn eye of one who has seen her destiny. Sometimes you can be sure, in a single minute, she said with somber conviction, and added humbly, I don't know why I should be so lucky. Once Harry danced with Gloria Swanson at a charity ball. I don't know what he can see in me. One Sunday morning, I was standing in a crowd in Middlesex Street Market, absorbed in watching a small Irishman working the 3-card trick. "All you got to do is keep your eye on me hands," he confided out of the corner of his wide, rubbery mouth. "Now, watch it, sports." He showed us the lady and dexterously shuffled the cards on a folding green baize table. At that moment, Fanya came out of Strongwater's delicatessen, holding a brown paper bag. She was with a man in a curly-brimmed hat, worn well back on a thatch of red hair. I could tell he was an actor by the elegant way he smoked his cigarette. Otherwise, he looked no different from a tailor. Excited, I was just about to follow when the Irishman grabbed hold of me. "There's some of you wouldn't trust an Irish fellow with the price of a drink," he said gloomily. "Now look at this young laddie, a face of innocence like a holy choir boy. Put your finger on that card, lad. Now listen, if I was to say this boy's digit is on the lovely Queen of Hearts, would any of you sports venture to believe me for 10 bob? No one ventured. Disconsolately, the Irishman turned up the card. It was the Queen, and I hurried away. In Fieldgate Street, I slipped over to the opposite pavement to get a good view of the actor's profile, and they saw me. I gazed intensely into a watchmaker's window at a man fishing for tiny cogwheels with a magnifying glass screwed into his eye, and pretended to be there accidentally. They came over. "Well, stranger, what are you doing in this district?" Fanya said in a modulated voice, as if we were as far afield as Oxford Street at least. I looked round and gave a stimulated start of surprise. Rosenheim's hand rested on the soft inside of Fanya's upper arm, and he stroked the skin musingly with his forefinger. She told him who I was. They'd obviously discussed her connection with our family, because he looked at me with interest. "I heard a lot about your mother and father," he said. The accent was just like a Chicago gangster's. "What Fanya tells me, they is marvelous people." His pale grey eyes blinked with sincerity. "Especially your mother. She look after this young girl like her own daughter." He squeezed Fanya's plump arm, and she gazed back adoringly. "No, we gotta go. Give my best to your pipple, sonny," he said, and as they were about to leave, remarked as an afterthought, "Liebchen, bring the boy one evening. Maybe he's interested to see the Backstage. Why not?" Frankly, I didn't expect much from the Pavilion. A Jewish theatre was not the London Palladium, after all, but it was a shock to discover that the stage door led into a building as filthy, neglected, and unromantic as the corridors of our tenement. Fanya took me into the costume room. There was a treadle machine and a bench for pressing clothes. A yellowed Ministry of Labour poster on the whitewashed wall was prosaically concerned with fire regulations, and you could smell the toilet next door. Mrs. Myers, the wardrobe mistress, was a heavy-breasted woman whose square face disappeared into the folds of her neck. They were doing Hamlet. Mrs. Myers told me the plot, although she'd never actually found time to see the play right through. It was about a prince who had a mother, a monster. Together with his uncle, the king's brother, she poisoned his father, her own husband, then married with the murderer. From this, the prince had such aggravation, he turned against the whole world. Even to his fiancée, a beautiful girl, he behaved so badly that she drowned herself. Mrs. Myers described it all so vividly, I could hardly wait to see the drama for myself. I couldn't quite follow the Shakespearean Yiddish. It wasn't in the slightest like the iambic pentameters spoken in our classroom through the pinched Gentile nostrils of Mr. Parker, my schoolmaster, and it didn't sound like anything my mother said. Only when Rosenheim, gravely pacing the stage and plucking at his chin, began the famous soliloquy, did I start to get the gist of things. "Zu sein oder nicht zu sein, das ist der Frage. said Rosenheim, in a slow, perplexed, but remarkably resonant voice. Fanya gazed at him with petrified eyes, as if afraid he might make the wrong decision. But soon I became terribly bored. It was more diverting to eavesdrop on the actors, who stood around smoking between scenes, scratching their itching faces to avoid smearing the grease paint, and grumbling about the audience. One by one, the actors stubbed out their cigarettes and went on stage to be murdered. When it was Rosenheim's turn to die, he jerked and quivered for a long time. Patches of sweat showed on his tunic as he spread out his arms and drooped his flaming head in a crucified gesture. The sound of crunching peanut shells could be heard all over the theatre as the audience stampeded towards the exits. He stood motionless until the curtains swished together. Fanya hurried to him. "Harry," she said, "darling, oh, that was so marvellous. I can't tell you." Rosenheim squeezed her hands without a word, too moved to speak, then left the stage. "He really suffers," Fanya said tearfully. "When he plays, he gives his whole heart and soul." She ran after him and disappeared into the dressing room. There was nobody around. I advanced stealthily into the center of the empty stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, people of the world," I said quietly in deep tones, gesturing towards the auditorium. Then, louder, "Zu sein oder nicht zu sein." My voice went squeaky in the middle of a word. From pit to gallery, empty rows of seats gave me their attentive silence. "I am," my voice began, "I am... What?" I would soon be 14. I wore glasses and had failed the scholarship. There was nothing to say. The New York Yiddish Theatre ended its season and departed. I never saw Rosenheim again. The reason he couldn't take Fanya with him right away was because as soon as the actors returned to New York, they would have to go on a tour of all the places in America where Jews lived. She begged him to take her along. After all, it was useful to have someone who was handy with a needle. But no. Such a dog's life of travel, cheap boarding houses, draughty public halls, she should never experience. God forbid. Rosenheim wanted her to come to him like a princess. For this, everything had to be made ready, a nice apartment, wall-to-wall carpets, a good air conditioning so summer and winter would always be the same, maybe even a colored maid in a frilly apron. For his angel bride-to-be, nothing but the best. The whole of New York, America, the world, he would give to her. But it would take a little time, a little patience. Fanya was disappointed, for she only wanted Rosenheim, not the world. But love gave her strength to wait. She brought round a postcard he sent her from New York. Over the towers of Manhattan, he had written in Yiddish, "My love is bigger than the Empire State, tallest building in the whole world. Your Harry." From Chicago, at the back of a picture of Lakeshore Drive, were the words, "I miss you, sweet angel, and my tears fill the lake." The message from Pittsburgh was shorter. "Thinking of you always." There was a gap of some weeks. Then a card from San Francisco. "The Examiner writes, Rosenheim's Hamlet a triumph. Wish you were here to see." Next time Fanya came to tea, she was wearing an old dress, and her face without makeup looked as thin and hungry as when she first came to be an apprentice. My mother gazed at her keenly and led her out into the bedroom. They talked in low voices, then Fanya rushed out and left, drowning in tears. "Of course she's pregnant," my mother muttered to Mrs. Benjamin next door. Anybody can see. She leaned back in the chair, hands clasped over her own big belly. Mrs. Benjamin stared in horrified delight. Pregnant? From him? From the actor? How else? From a wind in the stomach? Mrs. Benjamin slapped herself on the cheek and rocked from side to side. Ay, 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 ay. Such a bandit, that Rosenheim. You should never trust a ginger, Rosa. In a ginger, the blood boils like in a kettle. And when, she added eagerly, is she expecting? Tomorrow, I'm taking her to see Fat Yetta. Tears dripped from my mother's nose. She'd unsuccessfully visited Fat Yetta on a couple of occasions herself. Please, God, it should work. That poor child is like my own daughter. Fat Yetta was at first reluctant to take the case. My mother told Mrs. Benjamin the following day when it was all over. She'd agreed to do so only out of pity for the plight of such a young girl. My mother got up heavily and closed the living room door so that none of us should hear the shocking details. So, of course, we eavesdropped. It was terrible, she said in an agonized whisper that penetrated the wall. A living child was torn from her body. Each fingernail was perfect, and the neshama, the soul, was struggling to breathe. If I live to 100, I'll remember it all my life. There was a prolonged silence before she resumed speaking. It should be put in a coffin and sent to that murderer, my mother declared in a terrible voice. She opened the door. Go out, children. Go out and play. When I came back in, Mrs. Benjamin had left and the whole place was filled with a spicy aroma of boiling chicken. My mother filled a jar with soup and sealed the lid with wax paper. She told me to take it to Fanya. It was one of those leaden Sunday afternoons in January. I carried the soup under my jacket against my breast, and its warmth was the only comforting thing in a bleak walk along Brick Lane. Shreds of a poster advertising New York's brilliant Yiddish players still adhered to a board outside the pavilion. The poster was still there months later, when Fanya Zeigelbaum moved up to Manchester, where no one knew of her disgrace. Night times passing under the railway arch, I thought how different it might have been if I had been older, uncommonplace, enhanced by the glamour of strangeness.